Hello and welcome. I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and today I have another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads for you all. This time covering Fifth Son by Camilla Townsend, a new history of the Aztecs. This is a nonfiction history book about the conquest of the Aztec Empire, or the creation of the colonies of New Spain in modern Mexico, or however you want to describe this particular period, although it is also about a number of historical things, both before and after. In particular, the after has to do with the sources used for this history. One of these historical resources that Townsend really emphasizes is that in the aftermath of the Spanish conquests, they obviously set up a colonial government, essentially. All sorts of different things that they did, but one of them is setting up all of these church schools associated with different Catholic, often monastic orders, which created essentially a new, for lack of a better term, scribal tradition that has to do with all of these people who often were partially or fully indigenous by birth, and were familiar with the traditions of their families, their lineage, all of that sort of stuff, even several generations after the first period of conquest, and who wrote down a number of the historical and sometimes semi-historical details of the events of the conquest, and even the histories before that, wrote down in the language spoken by the indigenous peoples, Nahuatl. And I guess I should start saying I really apologize for mispronunciations. There are definitely going to be some. My pronunciation is not necessarily particularly good, even with all sorts of regular, more familiar words. So with all of the different words from Nahuatl and the Mexica and all of that sort of stuff, it's probably going to be bad. So yeah. Anyway, but there are all of these essentially scholars from this local population who end up utilizing the Latin alphabet brought over for writing in Spanish to write these histories in Nahuatl. So they're using the letters to show the sounds as if you were pronouncing the words, as you do with all sorts of other forms of writing, but specifically to write down these stories and histories from their own tradition. And that this is a resource that has been underutilized in the study of the conquest of these Mesoamerican polities in this period, in the early 16th century and all that. So that's sort of where Fifth Son positions itself. I guess you might say that it is a history of this period that makes greater use of a lot of these indigenous resources, basically all of these histories that have been underutilized, and that have not necessarily contributed as much to our understanding of the history of this complex and tempestuous period. Often the greater emphasis has been put on the histories written by the Spanish, and the various records left behind by the conquistadors, essentially, and that this is an attempt to sort of balance things out. And there's still stuff used by so there's still material from this kind of Spanish tradition, this is specifically Spanish colonial tradition that is used in here. So there's some discussion about historical misconceptions, and in particular there's a discussion about the tradition of this idea that when the conquistadors show up, they are greeted. In particular, Cortez himself is greeted as the appearance or reincarnation or somehow avatar of the local god Quetzalcoatl, the white god who is supposed to arrive, and that this is a major causal element in the collapse of this, Aztec control over modern day Mexico. And there's some discussion of the fact that there's no evidence from the earliest sources of any of this material, that this idea of the conquistadors being treated as religious avatars on some level only shows up in later writings written long after the fact, and in all of the original letters that Cortez wrote reporting on his actions, that there's no evidence of this. And there's some other places like that there are historical interpretations that make use of the Spanish writings from the conquistadors, in addition to these Nahuatl writings from the indigenous scribes in the aftermath of the conquest. Anyway, so that's all sort of about kind of the historical processes involved, I guess. Let's talk a little bit about what is actually in this book, because I think it's really interesting. It's a period that obviously has really pretty immense consequences for the history of that part of the world and a lot of other parts of the world. There's not really a discussion in this book of the long-term consequences of this period of European colonialism. But obviously this becomes a huge vector for wealth traveling from the New World to the Old World, and has pretty long-term consequences for all sorts of other things going on in the world in the aftermath of the conquest, that is kind of beyond the scope of this particular book, but I think is something to keep in mind when talking about the long-term historical causal consequences of the events in here. And the events in here start with the arrival of the people who will eventually become the Aztecs, the Mexica people, who speak Nahuatl, who arrive in this part of the world, having traveled out of territory north of this, and there are believed to be a number of waves of population coming from basically the area around like modern day New Mexico and Arizona into central Mexico, essentially, and eventually they settle down and found Tenochtitlan, and that this is the capital city of what will become sort of described as the Aztec Empire. And it's where Moctezuma rules from, and the conquistadors end up arriving there, and there's all sorts of chaos in the streets and the conquest and all that sort of stuff. But there are a number of other cities, a number of other settlements that also have some level of political authority over the hinterlands around them. And sometimes they are in alliance with these other cities, and sometimes they're fighting wars, and there's all this kind of complicated interrelationship of these different polities on the ground. And then that historical writing, this discussion of the kind of setup of all this part of the world, basically, we get to the point of basically what from these sources do we know that it was like just before the arrival of the Spanish in the area. And then, of course, what happens during the conquest. And there are, I think, three chapters that are basically about the conquest. And that's probably the most intense parts of the book. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff going on, and there's some interesting discussion of kind of historical causality. In particular, there's a whole discussion of like I mentioned, this whole idea of the kind of avatar of Quetzalcoatl versus what was the sort of native response to the indigenous response to these Spanish conquistadors showing up. And in particular, making a point that in these Nahuatl sources, they are not deluded by this kind of idea of the mythology and all that sort of stuff, that they are much more clear-sighted about the, in particular, military advantages that these Spanish conquistadors have, that they have access to steel weapons, swords, and armor, and guns, and horses, and all of these things that are very useful for winning battles, that many of the various polities, aside from Tenochtitlan, end up seeing essentially an opportunity for themselves to advance their position in the world by allying with the new powerful people in the region, who are the Spanish conquistadors. The Aztecs themselves and Moctezuma are well aware of the danger that these very, very dangerous, even though they are numerically relatively limited, this new force of very dangerous warriors and what it represents for the dangers to the empire, and that they're attempting to figure out how to kind of manage all of the different concerns for maintaining this political stability that they have attempted to build. And there's some really interesting stuff about, for lack of a better term, the kind of realpolitik going on in this period that has perhaps been underemphasized in sources that really specifically follow the Spanish writings on the subject. The Spanish records that don't necessarily present the indigenous leaders as being nearly so clear-sighted and aware of the much more material threats, rather than this kind of grand mythologized ideas of the passage of history and all that sort of stuff. And so that gets us through the conquest, basically. And then the last couple of chapters are about the aftermath. And so there's a discussion of how people lived in the aftermath, the kind of new relationships that are established, the complex power politics, because the indigenous people in the area remain a huge majority of the population. And there is a sort of continual fear of the possibility of a rebellion starting up and spreading throughout all of this territory. And there's fears among the different Spanish officials of the possibility that someone will decide to declare independence and take over this New Spain in Mexico and turn it into its own polity, basically. And so there's a lot of kind of interesting stuff in a period of history that even more so than the initial conquest itself is probably underrepresented in a lot of people's historical understanding. Certainly in mine, I have a kind of general idea that surely there must have been things happening in like the 1540s and 50s in modern day Mexico, but perhaps not a particularly sophisticated understanding of what was going on, but that is made more sophisticated by reading Fifth Son. And then finally, we kind of come all the way around to a discussion of these Nahuatl scholars who wrote a lot of the sources down that are used for the histories in this book. A lot of these figures who have sort of a complicated position in this new world. These, often indigenous men, sometimes who have some connection with the Spanish beyond just being scholars, but who have a real desire to write down this history that in their own time, a couple generations after the conquest, so much of it is very rapidly being lost, and a lot of these kind of oral historical traditions that were a major part of how these peoples in before the conquest, how they recorded, how they kept track of all of this history. And those traditions, of course, are dependent upon living memory. And so when people die, you lose out on that material unless they're able to share it with other people who can then themselves remember it. And so there's a real recognition of the crisis of historiography that is going on in this period of like the 1570s and 1580s, after many of the people who lived through the conquest are dying out just from old age. And so there's a really interesting section of this book that is sort of about that, about the creation of a lot of the sources that are used for this particular book, which is cool. It's neat and it's fun. And I am really not an expert on anything about this period of history or anything like that. So I cannot really speak to how Fifth Son necessarily compares to other histories of the period, other historical sources. I can't speak to how new this new history of the Aztecs is or anything like that, because I really do not have enough of a historical background to know. But I can say that I really liked this book and thought it was a lot of fun. And it is because it is a period that I don't really have much familiarity with beyond a sort of passing understanding of some of the largest changes that go on. It was really interesting to read about all of this stuff and learn more about a period that I just don't know that much about, but that definitely has some pretty serious consequences for the history of all sorts of places, including Mexico itself. So, yeah, pretty cool stuff. I would definitely recommend this one. So, if you have read Fifth Son, if you know about the history of the Aztecs and the conquest of Mexico and Hernan Cortez and all these different things, leave a comment down below. Otherwise, I've been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.